from the middle to the end, it's just land allotment, and we don't have to spend a lot of time on that. So the bulk of Joshua is up till chapter 12, and then from 13 onwards, there are some significant things, but the heart of Joshua is 5 through to 12. I should say 1 through to 12. So in chapter 5, we are introduced to a new circumcision and God's promise. I'm just going to put the slides up so we already have it there. And what you have in this section is a remembrance of the covenant and the promise that God has made with Israel. It is interesting that these are adults who have come at least 40 years, come from the wilderness. They are now in Canaan, and only at this stage, as adults, men of war, are they circumcised. Now, the question obviously is, but why? So, there's two things. Sorry. Number one, God delivered and will deliver his people. And I'll show you that in a moment's time. And number two is God will fight for his people. So how does that connect to the circumcision and God's promise? So what does circumcision signify in Old Testament theology? Anyone? Is there a roaming mic? You can take my left one. I'm right-handed. Oh, yeah. Answer for us, please. Go ahead.
So it signifies that you are part of God's people or God's covenant people.
Okay. Elaborate on that. What was it called? What was circumcision called? Starts with a S. Yeah, I heard it. It's a sign of the covenant. So, these people are covenant people because God has already made the covenant with Abram, and as a sign of that covenant, they need to be circumcised. And so, yes, they are covenant people by this stage. So it doesn't matter that they have not been circumcised. So God is doing this for very specific reason. They are covenant people, but to demonstrate that God is faithful to his covenant and that they are part of the covenant people, they have to be circumcised. Now, look at 5, verse 1. As soon as all the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan to the west, and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea heard that Yahweh had dried up the waters of the Jordan for the people of Israel until they had crossed over, their hearts melted, and there was no longer any spirit in them because of the people of Israel. It's not per se that they fear Israel, but what God has done for this people. If he's able to open the oceans, there's no God that can do this. If he's able to stop the flow, the very source of the flow of the Jordan River, and allow them to walk on dry land, that's instantaneous miracle. There's no God that can equal this God's power. And so they are scared of Israel because of Israel's God. At that time, Yahweh said to Joshua, make flint knives and circumcise the sons of Israel a second time. So Israel has already been circumcised in Abram, and now there is no second circumcision for this group of people. This is their circumcision. Verse 5. Though all the people who came out had been circumcised, yet all the people who were born on the way to the wilderness after they had come out of Egypt had not been circumcised. So it clears up that confusion that this is a second circumcision. It's not. It's just saying that this is the first, a second version of what God has already done, which was when God made a covenant with Abram. Right, now, verse 10. While the people of Israel were camped at Gilgal, they kept the Passover, and on the 14th day of the month, even at the evening on the plains of Jericho, and a day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. And the manna ceased the day after they ate of the produce of the land. Quick question here. So number one, it's still within the same time period. They were circumcised. Where do men go during the Passover? Do you remember? To Jerusalem. So there's no Jerusalem yet, right? There's no place to walk to yet. So God obviously sets the stage for the absence of men by means of this circumcision. Who's surrounding them? Pagan Canaan nations, cities. The very next thing is the fall of Jericho. But notice, Israel has just been circumcised. The men of war have just been circumcised. They are not ready to go to war. They are not ready to go and fight. I believe God does this for a very specific reason, to show to Israel that it's not your fight. You are not able to do anything to conquer any land if I don't say so. And so God disables the men of war so that the victory can belong to him. God proves by these two things that he will deliver as he had delivered. The circumcision is significant on a number of levels. God reaffirms his covenant with Israel, and he illustrates that he will fight for his people. Look at verse 13. And when Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with a drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went up to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries? And he said, "No, I am the commander of the army of Yahweh. Now I have come." Come to do what? Come to fight for you. God shows by means of his provision to Israel that God reveals himself as a warrior that will fight for his people. That doesn't mean that they won't go into captivity. That doesn't mean that he withholds his hand at some stage. But at this stage, he shows himself forth as a warrior. The second aspect that we have to consider is found in chapter 6, is the various campaigns that takes place in chapter 6, moving forward through to chapter 12. Israel campaigns and God's goodness. God promised that they would get the land, and so God has already revealed himself as one that will fight for them, and so he sends them out towards, first place was Jericho. There's three components of God fighting for Israel. It's the central region, the southern region, and the northern region. In the central fight, God shows forth his centrality and as warrior in Israel's wars. The second region in the south shows God's faithfulness to his people, and then the third region shows God's sovereignty in Israel's fights. So the fall of Jericho is pretty obvious. We know the story is this dramatic event that takes place in the life of Israel. Remember, men are not really able to draw the sword. They've been disabled, but God causes the walls to fall in on itself, is the language. How does a wall fall in on itself? That means it crumbles. And it didn't fall that way, it didn't fall this way. It crumbles, and actually, as it falls, creates a step ladder for Israel to invade Jericho. What does Israel do in this fight? What did they do? Do you remember? Verse 20. So the people shouted, and the trumpets were blown. And as soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpet, and the people shouted a great shout, the walls fell down on itself, so that the people went up into the city. Do you see that connection there? The walls fell in such a way so that the people could actually enter the city. Why did they enter the city? To burn it. They devoted all in the city to destruction, both men and women, young and old, sheep and donkeys, with the edge of the sword. God wins the fight for Israel. Joshua gives glory to God for his ability to fight on behalf of his people. Just want to see where I am. The central fight relates also to chapter 7, which is the defeat at Ai, or as some people would say, Ai. I think, so in Hebrew it's actually every vowel is pronounced, and so it's probably better to say Ai rather than I. Right, brother? You remember that lesson? You we'll be there. Yeah, so unless it's a diphthong, it generally gets enunciated individually. So the people of Israel broke faith, it starts with, in this situation. And there's a dramatic development. So God gives victory to them in Jericho. So they have confidence now. This major central place of fortified city, or I should say this fortified city, just fell into their hands. They didn't have to do much. All they had to do was blow a trumpet and scream at the top of their lungs, and they were given the city. And so they are very confident at this stage. Chapter 7 opens with a very sad tone. But the people of Israel broke faith. And that is important, because you will find out that there's actually just one person, but all of Israel are counted as accountable and complicit in this sin. All Israel broke faith in regard to the devoted things. For Achan, the son of Carmi, son of Zabdi, son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, took some of the devoted things, and the anger of Yahweh burned against, notice, the people of Israel. And you'll see this when I repeat it at the end. That is repeated over and over. The people of Israel, all Israel, the people of Israel, all Israel. Why does he do that? To show the unification of this group of people, that their victory is seen as a people, but their defeat is also seen as a people. What leads to their victory is God fighting for them. What leads to their defeat is their individuality. You get the significance. When they are unified, they are walking with the Lord. When they are individuals, they are walking for themselves. That's a huge point. God holds them all accountable for this one sin. And so the defeat of Ai is is given in chapter 7, verse 1 through 5. And so Joshua sends the guys out, they go and fight. And what is significant about this? 37 or 36? Let me see. I think it's 37 people die in this fight. This is the first time Israel loses a man in war. First time in their campaigns that they lose somebody to a fight. So, very difficult situation for Israel. Notice what it says in verse 4. So, about 3,000 men went up from there. The reason they only sent 3,000 is because they thought, easy fight. They are not as big as the other nations. So, yeah, we can overcome them pretty easily. And they fled before the men of Ai. And the men of Ai killed about 36 of their men and chased them before the gate as far as Shebarim and struck them at the descent. And the hearts of the people melted and became as water. They were concerned. Why? This was their first defeat, their first death because of war. So definitely a very painful experience for the people. Joshua repents in verse 6 and realizes that something is not right. But notice what he says in verse 9. For the Canaanites and all the inhabitants of the land will hear of it and will surround us and cut off our name from the earth. What will you do for your great name? Why does he say that? Why does he ask God to act? Because God promised, right? Don't be afraid. I will be with you and I will fight for you. God doesn't fight for them. Why? Because they became, let me put it this way. There was individuality in their midst. There was sin. So the sin of Achan is pretty simple. He goes in, steals a couple of things, comes back, hides it in his tent. So, why then does God hold Israel responsible for Achan's sin? Question to you guys. Why do you think that is the case? While you're thinking, notice what it says in verse 12. Therefore, the people of Israel cannot stand before the enemies. They turn their backs before the enemies because they have become devoted for destruction, and I will be with you no more unless you destroy the devoted things from among you. Get up, consecrate the people, and say, consecrate yourselves for tomorrow. Thus says the Lord God, or Yahweh God of Israel, there are devoted things in your midst, O Israel. You cannot stand before your enemies until you take away the devoted things from among you. Over and over you get this term, devoted things, devoted things, devoted things. Why is that important? Because God told them, leave the devoted things. It belongs to me. So devoted to destruction, burn it. Make sure it comes to me. Don't take it for yourself. It's not yours to own. And so Achan has got long fingers. And so he thinks, it's just a little cup. It's just one or two things. So nothing to worry about. Why does God hold the entire nation of Israel accountable for Achan's sin? I think it's very simple. It may be on your tongue. Go ahead.
I want to say that the covenant was not individual. It was with the nation. And so thinking if there's one impurity, then, God's presence, then that blemish spoils the whole thing. And there's responsibility on each person, obviously, to keep watch over each other generally in community. But covenant is with the nation. So if there's one person in error, the whole collective is sullied. Yeah, and affected, yeah.
Well said.
So God's presence gone.
So the lesson here is that individual sin has widespread impact on the community. You can see this in the home. When a father steals, the entire family is affected. When a mother robs a bank, the entire family is affected. That's very unlikely. Sin has widespread consequences, and that's the lesson that God is teaching them. Your individual sin impacts the entire community. Do we have a New Testament correspondence or a parallel to this? Leaven in what passage? 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Thank you, brother. Yes, there is a New Testament parallel to this, where Paul deals with the leaven in your midst, that you have to clean out the sin that is in your midst, because the entire church is being affected. There's sickness, there's death, there's suffering in your midst because you're not dealing with the sin. God holds the entire church accountable for not dealing with the sin of an individual person. The same reality, the same truth applies, that individual sin has widespread consequences on the community, just as our brother Manda just said there, that the covenant is not individualistic. You are an individual in the community of faith under the covenant. You're an individual that shares a common faith with others under the covenant. That's exactly the same reality that we have today as God's people. Under the new covenant, you're an individual in a community of faith under the new covenant. So you are not an individual by yourself. Individuality in Christianity destroys churches. So God holds them accountable and makes them responsible to weed out that sin. It's exactly the same in the New Testament. You find the sinner, the offender, and you deal with it. Notice what they have to do at the end of this chapter. And all Israel, in verse 25, all Israel stoned him, and they burned them with fire and stoned them and stoned them with stones. And they raised over him a great heap of stones that remains to this day. Then Yahweh turned from his anger. Therefore, to this day, the name of the place is called the Valley of Anchor, which means trouble, because he brought trouble on Israel. It's a lesson for us. Individuality will destroy the community of faith. So, after the repentance, which is in chapter 7, verse 6 through to 26, they were responsible to take care of this sin. Interesting. You allowed it. So think about this. When he went to war with the men of war, he's carrying those things with him back to his tent. Think about that. There was no place to hide. You didn't go to war with a satchel. You didn't go with a bag. You didn't have a rucksack. You went with your sword and with water. And oftentimes, if it's in the heat of battle, you would put your water down because you either need your slingshot or just your sword or shield. You are not fighting with a backpack. They saw him carry those things back to his tent, his family. You are not getting it by your family. As he walked from Jericho back to his tent, everybody sees that this guy is taking stuff that he shouldn't. They didn't deal with it. And so God says, Israel has sinned because Israel is participating in Achan's sin because they've not held him accountable. The exact same thing happens in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, where the church is held accountable and they participate in the sin. And Paul says, you think yourself to be spiritual? You think that you are wiser than God? You are participating in this man's sin. And so Israel is held accountable because they did not deal with the sin as it arose, and his family is held accountable because they did not turn him in as the sin arose. And so they died with him. The second part that deals with the central campaign is how God shows his power and his victory at Ai. Notice in verse 26, Joshua did not draw back his hand, which was stretched out, which he stretched out the javelin until he had devoted all the inhabitants of Ai to destruction. Only the livestock and the spoil of the city Israel took as their plunder according to the word of the Lord that he has commanded Joshua. So Joshua made sure to do exactly as God commanded him. So Joshua burned Ai and commanded it, and made it forever a heap of ruins, as it is to this day. And he hanged the king of Ai on a tree until evening. So I'll just read until there. The story of Ai is another dramatic event where God provides significant victory to the people of Israel, and Ai, being greater in number, more advanced in artillery, could not withstand the hand of the Lord against them. And so Israel is granted victory. In the southern and northern campaigns, you note that there are two alliances which actually identify both the southern alliance and the northern alliance, and two wars that are going to take place between chapter 9 and chapter 12. And there's quite a few things happening here. You find the deception of Gibeon, or the Gibeonites, in chapter 9, and I'll get back to that in a moment's time. You find a dramatic event that takes place in chapter 10 where the sun stands still, and then you have the conquest of the northern alliance in chapter, I think it's 11, chapter 11. So that is the next few sections. So there's victory over these two alliances. Again, you have the scene set for us in chapter 9, verse 1. As soon as all the kings who were beyond the Jordan, notice it says all the kings beyond the Jordan in the hill countries, and now he's telling us which side, identifying it's the southern part of Canaan, and in the lowland all along the coast and of the Great Sea towards Lebanon, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites heard of this. They gathered together as one to fight against Joshua and Israel. After they heard of the defeat of Ai, now at this stage, they come together and they decide to fight against Israel. But when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they on their part acted with cunning or deception, and went and made ready provisions and took worn out sacks for their donkeys and wineskins, worn out and torn and mended, and worn out patched sandals on their feet, and worn out clothes. This is a very sophisticated plan to deceive Israel. And all their provisions were dry and crumbly. And they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal. Understand that Joshua is still with Israel in Gilgal. Gibeah, or the Gibeonites, are about an 8-hour walk from where Gibeah is to Gilgal. It's a long journey. Notice what he says. We have come from a distant country, not so distant, it's only 8 hours. So now make a covenant with us. So this was usually a day's travel, with all the stops and the water breaks and with the kids crying and all those kind of things. Usually about a day. It is presumed that they made it in a shorter trip to show how tired they are. And like they are sweating, they are parched, and so they are seeking refuge with Israel. Verse 7. But the men of Israel said to the Hivites, perhaps you live among us. Then how can we make a covenant with you? They said to Joshua, we are your servants. And Joshua said to them, who are you? And where do you come from? They said to him, from a very distant country your servants have come, because of the name of Yahweh your God. For we have heard a report from him and all that he did in Egypt. And so they are trying to win them over by their testimony. Notice what it says in verse 14. So the men took provisions, but did not ask counsel from the Lord. And Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them and let them live, and the leaders of the congregation swore to them. So they made an oath with them. Why is that a problem? Why is that not right? The answer is they didn't consult God. So they were leaders given to Joshua and to Israel. Joshua and the leaders, the elders and the men of war were given to Israel as leaders, and they had to consult God in order for them to move forward. But God gave very clear instruction. When you go, make a peace treaty with them. If they give up, then you don't have to kill them. If they don't, you wipe them out. Very simple. Israel decides that you can live amongst us. This is the first place that Israel does not conquer. They are given permission to survive and permission to still own their own district. That was not God's plan. So Gibeah survives, and even though they are quote unquote servants of Israel, they are not really conquered by Israel, and this will come back to bite them later on. This is a lesson. They were deceived because they did not ask counsel from the Lord. They didn't seek wise counsel from God. Follow God's counsel. Deuteronomy 17:19. They should have sought counsel. They should have be very clear as to what God requires concerning the invasion of the land, and they did not. God allows us to take place, and they are bound by the covenant with their vow to the Gibeonites. And it's interesting, the Gibeonites leave, and they are then caught in a war or a standoff, and they call Israel to come and help. And this is where the war actually comes in. So Israel, in chapter 10, starts to make their way towards Gibeah. Remember, 8-hour trek. Why do you think that is significant? Because it's a long distance to get from Gilgal to Gibeah, and when they get there, they're not only tired, there's not enough daytime to win this war. So God miraculously extends the day so that the war can take place and so that Israel can stand in marvel of God's power. Again, what you see here is God's intervention. Not only do you see it in Jericho, in Ai, and now you see it here at the borders of Gibeah. Notice what it says in verse 11. It's actually pretty funny. And as they fled, now notice the men of Israel they are tired by this stage because they just come to the front line of the war, and so they have to engage. But notice what God does. As they fled before Israel, while they were going down the ascent to Beth Horon, Yahweh threw down large stones from heaven on them as far as Azekah, and they died. What are these large stones? God didn't stand there with stones in his arms and no, that's not what it meant. Notice what it says in the next line. There were more who died because of the hailstones than the sons of Israel killed with the swords. God again displays his intervention and his power in war. Why? Because he promised that I will fight for you. In verse 12, we see the sun stands still at Gibeon and the moon in the valley of Ajalon. And the sun stood still and the moon stopped until the nation took vengeance on their enemies. Dramatic, supernatural event. And what's the lesson God gives here? That he will sovereignly fight for his people. Israel did not need to kill a lot of people. Just, I say it's funny because as I was reading through this, God pinpointed, let me put it this way, he chose the enemy by means of a hailstone. Think about that. The hailstone hit the enemies but did not hit Israel, the men of war in Israel. God is the ultimate sniper. So, obviously, I don't know how it happened, but yes, God pinpointed out the enemy and took them out one by one. So, let's move on. The alliances in the south eventually falls, and you see this in verse 16. These 5 kings, which have been mentioned previously, as I mentioned, I think it's in chapter 9 or 8, have hid themselves in the cave of Makkedah, and it was told Joshua and the 5 kings have been found hidden in the cave, and Joshua said, roll large stones against the mouth of the cave and set men to guard them. But do not stay there yourselves, pursue your enemies, attack their rear guard, and do not let them enter their cities, for Yahweh your God has given them into your hand. When Joshua and the sons of Israel had finished striking them with a great blow until they wiped out, and when the remnant that remained of them had entered into the fortified cities, then all the people returned safe to Joshua in the camp at Makkedah. None of them were lost. So in chapter 10 through to the end, you see the defeat of the southern alliance. There were these 5 kings who came together and realized that they cannot fight against Israel by themselves, and so they come together. Israel was outnumbered, Israel was out-artilleried, and yet God fights for them. Notice what Joshua says at the end in Joshua 10:42. And Joshua captured all the kings and the land at one time because Yahweh, God of Israel, fought for Israel. Shows again his faithfulness. And Joshua returned and all Israel with him to the camp. The unification of Israel is significant. He keeps on emphasizing this idea of them being together all the time. My time. The conquest of the north deals with there you go. The victory of the northern alliance. It has the same structure to the southern alliance. In verse 1 it says, when Jabin, king of Hazor, heard of this, he sent to Jobab, the king of Medan, and king of Shimron, and king of Akshap, and to the kings who are in the northern hill, and so he's identifying where they are, northern hill country, and in the Arabia, south of Shinarath, that's not China, and in the lowland, and in Nepherdor, and on the west to the Canaanites, and in the east, in the west, and the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites in the hill country, and the Hivites under Hermon in the land of Mizpah. And they came out with all their troops, great horde, in number like the sand on the seashore, very many horses and chariots. That phrase, and they came out like the sands of the seashore, is a metaphor to speak of a large number, uncountable number. And so there was a huge horde of army walking towards Israel. And God tells Joshua, don't worry, you're going to hamstring them all, and you're going to win this fight. That's in verse 9. That's divine authority given to wipe them out. And ultimately what happens is victory is given to Joshua, and you find the summary of Joshua's victory in verse 16. So Joshua took all the land in the hill country. This is now on the south, and then all the land of Goshen and the lowland and the Arabah and the hill country, Israel, and it's of Israel, and the lowland from Mount Halak, which rises from Seir, and now he's talking about the northern side to the valley of Lebanon below Mount Hermon, and he captured all the kings and struck them and put them to death. Joshua made war a long time with all those kings. And so what you see here between chapters 7 and 10 is Joshua capturing the major entrance points of the southern part and the northern part of Canaan. So all the kings were eventually defeated, and you see the overview here: the victory over the southern alliance, the victory over the northern alliance. And the overview of Israel victories is that God is sovereign over wars. In all of this, Joshua gives and reflects on God's work and God's power in providing victory to his people. All right, I need to move on. Summary of the two alliances. God is victory over the two alliances. God is sovereign over wars. Obedience is required even though God promises success, and then God intervenes on behalf of his people. We saw that quite frequently. And then God's favor is on a united people. United Israel is a testimony of God's faithfulness. When they are separated, not unified, it means that they are not putting on display God's faithfulness to them. They are disobedient. And you'll see later on when Israel eventually separates that it is God's name that is being blasphemed among the nations. So what you find in this war is tremendous. These wars are tremendous theological truths that are highlighted about God and not Israel. It's God's sovereignty, it's God's faithfulness, it's God's intervention, and God's favor on a united Israel. Any questions before we move on? Questions? No? Okay. Major themes thus far. God's faithfulness has come up quite a lot. God's authority. You'll see this in phrases like, I pointed out one, verse 9 of chapter 11, and Joshua did to them just as Yahweh said to him. So that phrase, just as Yahweh said to him, so all that God tells him to do, he did. Speaks about God's authority and God's permission for them to do certain things as they enter the land. You also find God's sovereignty in a variety of different acts that takes place. God is sovereign over war, and that's the point that Joshua is making, that we didn't win these battles. God gave us this victory. Consider the, let me just show something to you. In chapter 11, verse 20, the reason the northern alliance rallies against Israel is because God caused them to do so. Look at verse 20. For it was the Lord's doing to harden their hearts that they should come against Israel in battle, in order that they should be devoted to destruction and should receive no mercy, but be destroyed, just as, and here's again the divine authority, Yahweh commanded Moses. Take note of that. God's sovereignty over wars is seen in the Bible. He hardens the hearts of the kings and he causes them to go out against Israel. Why? So that they could be wiped out. So who does the fighting? It is God who fights against the enemies of Israel, and he ultimately wins the war for Israel. So definitely you see God's sovereignty over wars. You see God's sovereignty over Israel. Israel's obedience was still required. Even though God is sovereign, even though God promised them the land, even though God required that they invade the land, he still requires obedience. Okay, give me 3 minutes and I'll summarize this last section. In chapter 13 through to 22, you have tribal inheritance. The word is specifically chosen to indicate that God promised and it belongs to them, and so they will get it. And so the inheritance is handed over to the various tribes in Israel. Joshua, right through to Caleb, and everybody in between gets a portion of the land. And this demonstrates God's faithfulness despite Israel's disobedience. Why do I say Israel's disobedience? They chose to let the Gibeonites survive and did not conquer the land in that sense. That becomes a habit the longer they, or the further they go into Canaan. Second element that you see in this huge section 13 through to 22 is that God is the one who apportions the land. He tells Joshua, this land goes to this person or this tribe, and this is the regions that they get. God is the one that gives them the land. Why? Because the land ultimately belongs to God. The tribal inheritance is God's demonstration of his faithfulness to Israel in that he will fulfill every promise that is made concerning the land. Now, this raises a question: if Israel got all the land. Go to chapter 21, verse 43. It says, thus Yahweh gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it and settled there. Let's use confusion as to if they actually took possession of every element, or every corner of the land, or is it just parts of the land? I think the translations don't help here because the qualifying phrase actually tells you what God intends to say. They took possession of it and settled there. That's an indication of what God has fulfilled. So what is in view here is that God gave to Israel the land, quote unquote, that they possessed, the land that they took possession of. That has been given to them, and so they lived in the land, and God gave them that land, not every corner of the land yet. So all they promised up till the stage that they possessed, that land has been given to them. And in that way, no promise of God has been fulfilled. If every part of the land has been fulfilled at this stage, then chapter 24, verse 19 would not make sense. Chapter 23, verse 3 would not make any sense. Joshua is now old, and he says, as you have seen all that Yahweh has done to these nations for your sake, it is Yahweh your God who has fought for you. And that's the theme of Joshua, that God fights for his people. Now jump down to verse 5. Yahweh your God will push them back before you and drive them out of your sight, and you shall possess the land. Hang on. I thought that chapter 23 says that they've got all the land. Well, no, they didn't. It's only the land that they possessed at that stage that God has actually fulfilled and has given to them. And so Joshua, as he hands over the reins to the leaders now, he says to them, listen, you still need to continue the work. Continue to occupy the land because God has apportioned it to you. So I think that makes sense of the challenge of verse 43. And then chapter 23 and 24 deals with covenant loyalty. It ends on what God requires of them, and he does this by impressing upon Joshua's heart to recall the works of God, the promises of God, and the desire of God for his people. Now, we love verse 14, right? Is it verse 14? Verse 15. No, where is it? 15. Choose this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Do you have that in your house? People love that as a life verse or a house verse, but there's a lot left out. And so just take note of the entire context, and you may want to take it off your your wall. Notice what he says in verse 14. Now therefore fear Yahweh your God and serve him, and I'll get back to that in a moment's time, in sincerity and faithfulness. Put away the gods of your fathers, your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve Yahweh. So the context here that he said has to do with worship. He speaks about gods and God. And so he says, fear Yahweh, and your fear of Yahweh will be demonstrated in your worship of him, your service to him. So serve is a synonym or an expression of worship. And so he's talking about worshiping God. And so that word serve doesn't mean we as a family will come together and pack out the chairs. He's talking about we as our family will choose to hate the other gods while we worship the true and the living God. Now, verse 15. And if it is evil for you to serve Yahweh, that's the beginning of this verse. If it is evil for you to serve Yahweh, to worship Yahweh, choose this day whom you will serve. What is he doing? He's saying, there's an option here on the cards for you. You can either worship the idols or you can worship God, but you cannot worship both. Make a choice. You cannot worship both. But as for me and my house, we will serve or worship God. We've devoted ourselves to God and not to the idols. So the entire verse is fear God, serve God, put away the idols, choose this day whom you will serve. If it is evil for you to serve God, choose the idols. That's what he's saying. If God is not in your periphery, center part of your worship, go worship your idols. But as for us, we will serve the Lord. The people answered in verse 16, far be it from us that we would forsake Yahweh and to serve or worship other gods. Notice what Joshua says to them in verse 19. But Joshua said to the people, you are not able to worship God or serve God, for he is a holy God, and he is jealous, and he will not forgive your transgression and your sins. In other words, you don't have the heart to fully worship him alone. You have divided devotions. You need a change of heart. You're going to serve foreign gods. What Joshua ends on here is a call to worship, singular worship of not only the family, but the entire nation to singularly devote themselves to God. So covenant loyalty is seen in the worship of God, is seen in devoting yourself to God fully and formally in all that he requires. And that is Joshua done and dusted. I know I jumped over a lot, but that is it. Okay, any final questions or comments? Yes, sir. Make plans to wrap up.
Thanks. So I've got a question, just going back to the war chapter.
Which
I think
chapter?
it's Conquest 11.
Yeah.
I often think about this in relation to the current war in Israel, or in the East, as I would say. And my question is it enough to justify, therefore, or in the context of there's a winner and a loser, people will die, and some will not die. And Israel using that, or using this passage, for instance, to say that, the Ammonites, the Canaanites are sort of our enemies, and what we are doing is we are just trying to, have God fulfill his promises by us taking the land, and therefore us committing war crimes or war in that sense.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I'm asking it correctly, but
No, I
is
understand the
that,
question.
yeah.
There are definitely war crimes that are committed on both sides. In this case, Israel is merely defending and not actually trying to invade or take back the land. They rightfully can, based on God's promise to them. At this stage, they're not able to because it's not God's will. But there is a treaty that they need to offer, actually. God says that if they are trying to conquer land, to offer peace, instead of just going in and bombing people to obliteration. So, yeah, there are, I don't like to use the term war crimes because it's a modern term. I think there are offenses done on both sides, and we do need to acknowledge that Israel is not innocent in this war by no means. But they're still God's people, and so he will defend them despite their disobedience. And you'll see this actually not only through Joshua, but also in Judges. The reality is that because he's committed to his covenant to them, they will sin and do the wrong thing, but God's still going to defend them. Why? Because he's got a covenant with them. So Israel needs to do the right thing before God, and then they will be able to do the right thing before or to other people. And unfortunately, that's not going to happen until their hearts are changed. And so when Israel comes to saving faith, there will be peace on both sides. At this stage, that's not an opportunity. But yeah, it should help us think through the war because, first of all, God is sovereign over the wars. So he's actually causing the nations to come up against Israel, and the nations are not able to overcome Israel. They are losing people in their wars because they are fighting against Israel. Israel's losing less than than the nations that are fighting against them. So anyway, that's a long discussion. You and I can talk about that. Any other point of discussion? Go ahead. Just wait for the mic. Don't fight, guys.
So in chapter 15, there's a little section on the inheritance that Caleb gave to his daughter.
Chapter 15.
Yeah, in
Yes.
verse 19, roughly. I'm just wondering what the significance of it is.
What is the question?
Like, what is the significance? Why does it share these details? And I guess there are a lot of sections of like this narrative where I wonder how do we go about figuring out why is it in there? Sorry.
Why is it in the Bible? I'm
Yeah,
still not. I'm
like,
struggling.
what
You're
is it
talking
trying
about
to
the
teach us?
daughter that received a portion in the land? Why she mentioned? Is that the question?
Yes.
Yeah. When she came, verse 18. When she came to him, she urged him to ask her father for a field, and she got off a donkey. And Caleb said to her, "What do you want?" That is not actually rude in Hebrew. And she said to him, "Give me a blessing, since you have given me the land of Negev. Give me also spring of water." And he gave her the upper spring and the lower springs. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure uh, what the significance is. I mean, I probably have to look at this a little bit more. It could be that there was no son to take over the inheritance. I'm not exactly sure. Let me have a look at that a little bit more, and then I'll be able to provide an answer. Unless someone else has an answer ready at hand. If you look at your footnotes, it may be evident there. I think it had to do with either she was a widow or, if I remember correctly, or there was no son to take over the inheritance from the father, that she was given the land. I know that Deuteronomy does make an allowance for that to take. Is it Leviticus? Deuteronomy. If there are no men in the family, that the land can actually be given to the women until an heir is born. But yeah, I don't really know the significance of that. Yes, sir.
Is there maybe a connection between that verse and what's happening in 14, chapter 14, verse 9? And Moses swore on that day, saying, surely the land on which your foot has trodden shall be an inheritance for you and your children forever, because you have wholly followed Yahweh my God. And so Caleb then, his daughter, I guess, is given inheritance, which is connected to the land that Moses has sort of spoken about in chapter 14. So just fulfilling that request in saying,
Yeah, look, I think the idea there is that it's given to the children, that it will not pass away from that family. So I don't know if there's a direct relation in the sense that this woman specifically is in view there, but definitely in an overarching sense, yes, that the children, the land will remain in the family until there is an agreement that says otherwise. I do think if you read verse 15 of 15, chapter 15, it says, maybe 14, and Caleb drove out from there the three sons of Anak, Seshai, Heman, and Talmai, and the descendants of Anak. It's interesting that the descendants of Anak, if anybody knows anything about them, they are the descendants of the giants. And so he takes them the worst land. He's not scared. He's not a scared guy. And he went up from there against the inhabitants of Debir. Now the name of Debir, formerly Kiriath Sephar, and Caleb said, whoever strikes Kiriath Sephar and captures it, to him I will give Aksha, my daughter, as wife. And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, the brother of Caleb, captured it, and he gave him Aksha, his daughter, as a wife. I'm not exactly sure what the relationship is, but it seems like she was going to get the land because there wasn't a son or an heir to get the land, and so now she wants a portion. She wants a stick of the land, because I was going to get it, and now you've given me to this man, and so I'm not going to get it. So give me something, give me a piece as well. So I think that's the context. I can't remember. It's been a while since I've gone over my notes in OT survey. But yeah, let me research it more, and then I'll, when I get back to the next section, I will return and look at that. But remind me of that. Good question. Do you want to say something? Okay. That's last point, and then we'll end. Sorry for going so much over time, but we actually did start like half an hour late this morning.
Thanks. Yeah, I think also maybe that point has got to do with she was wanting springs because she got given the land of the Negev, which is like a desert. But anyway, I've got something from chapter 24 that I just want to back to that verse 15 that you brought up. And he says, and if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve. And then he actually gives them two options. And I mean, I don't want to complicate, what you said. It feeds into what you said. He says, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. And it's interesting because the gods whom your father serves, he's pointing back to the previous generation. Look at what they did and look where they ended up, because they all died in the wilderness.
True.
So you have this choice now. You serve God, or you do what your fathers did.
Yeah, but the gods of the Amorites are still present. So
Yeah.
he's got both of those, and I said he's giving them an option to serve pagan gods or the true God. And the only option is the logical outcome is the true and the living God. But he realizes that these people are fickle. They want something tangible. They want they want an idol, something to see. And so his desire here, if you are worshiping God, is what Joshua is after, is a single devotion to God. This is no different to what Jesus says in the New Testament. There has to be a single devotion to God. You can't share devotion with God. It's him or it's None. He's fully your God, or he's not your God. And on that word, I will end. Let me close in a word of prayer. Father, thank you for this truth and for the survey that just highlights how sovereign and faithful you are, and for all that you're able to do for your people. We stand in awe of your grace and your sustenance of Israel. Pray that you will continue to sustain them, even though the armies of the world are starting to coalesce against them. And we pray that you would honor your word, be faithful to your covenant, and sustain them through this. Thank you again for your goodness in providing us comfort that you are a God who is faithful, a God who deserves single devotion. And so, Lord, we pray that that would be true of us as well, that we would be faithful to you, and that we would worship you and you alone. So we give thanks to you in Christ's name. Amen.